In some ways, it feels like we have been in Kings forever, but we haven't been. But we only have a few more weeks left. It's been fascinating to hear some of you reflect on your time in this book. It's a challenging book, but it's a good book, and it is life-giving as God speaks to his people through it. There are a number of themes that you may have been noticing, but one of them clearly is the theme of leadership. When I became a Christian in high school, I was already pretty obsessed with leadership as an idea. Many of you know that I served in our school student government, and I had gone to leadership conferences, and I had gone to leadership camps. And then here I was going into my senior year, and I had this faith that I had owned and was ready to walk in, and was like hungry to learn about like what does it mean to follow Jesus. And one of the places I wound up was a Christian bookstore, thinking maybe there's some things I can learn. And I was drawn to the section where there were many books on Christian leadership. Right? Books like Biblical Leadership 101 or Jesus, CEO, Leading Like Jesus, and even 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders. These were some of my first grabs, my first reads. As a teenager, Christian leadership books tend to be really easy to get through, right? They don't tend to dig very deep. And they tend to be really practical, and they usually focus on, stuff that sort of has obvious application in our lives, like the mechanics of leadership or leadership styles. But Christian books almost universally give some attention, if not the bulk of their attention, to the character of a leader. Which in some ways, as I think about this, as I was preparing for this morning, makes it kind of insane, if we're just honest about it, that right now there is a national debate going on among evangelicals as to whether character is important for leadership. It's interesting because of sort of my own interests in leadership through the years. There have been a few different times where I thought, it might be fun to write a book about leadership. And so in a couple different places, I have some like notes and some ideas. But it turns out like writing a book like takes work and time, and who has any of that? And so it just has stayed like leaflets and old Bibles or things like that, where I'm like, yeah, if I write a book, that's what it's going to be about. But it's actually really interesting that we come to this passage this morning, because if I were going to write a book about leadership, this morning's passage would be one of my key texts, which is funny, and maybe it just reveals something about me, because this is not one of your go-to texts for Christian leadership generally in these books. But what we find in our passage this morning, what we heard read this morning by Beck and Jane, are 2 kings. 2 kings, Jehu, Jehoash. Jehu, Jehoash, really represent like the spectrum. Extreme and opposite leadership styles. Side by side then, they give us this really sort of provocative case study in radically different approaches to leading a people through change. For Christians, leadership matters. When we find ourselves leading others, which almost every single one of us do at some point because of the relationships that we're in, it matters how we lead. Whether that's leading our families, or leading a team at work, or leading in some form of government somewhere, or leading a ministry in the church. How we lead people and where we lead people matters. And when we find ourselves being led by others, which is a good portion of our lives, right? Whether that's at home, whether that's at work or school or church, like it matters who we follow. It matters the kinds of leaders that we follow and where we let those leaders take us. That's why I think that this morning's passage is so important for us. And so we're going to look at how Jehu and Jehoash each lead his people. And we're going to see if there's anything in this for us. In our own leadership of people, whether that's just a couple or many. And we're going to see if there's anything in this for us as we consider the kinds of leaders that the church has been called to raise up and to follow. So we'll start with Jehu. Oh, Jehu makes me uncomfortable for so many reasons. Jehu is a military commander in the northern kingdom. And this is what he's been doing for a number of years. He's respected. And out of nowhere, a prophet shows up and tells him the Lord is anointing him king over Israel. Which is awkward because Israel actually already has a king. So how's this going to work out, right? It's important then to consider how Jehu moves through the process of becoming a king. Because the kind of king that Jehu becomes is the same kind of person Jehu was before being king. Right? Sometimes we think that and as a youth pastor in youth ministry, this is sort of a go-to idea. I'll put this kid in a leadership position and they'll rise up to that position. Almost never happens. It just doesn't. The kind of person, the kind of teenager that they already are before you put them in that position is pretty indicative of the kind of person they'll continue to be once they're there. Leadership positions rarely make people start doing something that wasn't already in them before. And what we find, chapters 9 and 10, Jehu pretty much kills everyone. That's his go-to move. Jehu is a man of violence. That's all he knows. That's all he does. And he starts with the current king because it's hard to be king when somebody else is sitting on your chair. But then he expands his range, his vision, and he takes out the king's mother. And then he adds to that the king's 70 sons, their guardians, and the elders and the rulers in the city of Samaria. And then there's a royal group from the southern kingdom who come up to see the king that Jehu has killed. And just because they might be allied and might be close, he takes them out as well. Jehu is the very epitome of leadership through strength, right? He is the strongest and he has the biggest weapons. And so he will use his strength to eliminate every obstacle to achieving his goals. Jehu doesn't have time for anyone who doesn't fall into line with him. What he says goes. He is a dictator. If anyone gives even the appearance of being against him, he has an easy answer. Kill him, right? You figure that out with Jehu pretty quickly. Jehoash, then, couldn't be any more different from Jehu. And this is actually pretty easily explained by the story. Jehoash was the last remaining male descendant of David. He was the heir to the throne in Judah. And he had barely survived. See, when he was born, his grandmother went on a bit of a crazy killing spree, and she tried to destroy the entire royal family. But Jehoash had been hidden away by a priest who realized what was going on, got him away in order to preserve him until just the right time. And that right time came. 7 years later, when Jehoash was only 7 years old. 7 years old. as king. You can imagine Jehoash wasn't much of a fighter at 7 years old. And I don't know about you, but as like an adult person, I don't take commands from a 7-year-old very well. I don't know if you like to be bossed around by children, but that's a bit disorienting. So you can see how the context required a radically different approach to leadership. And in Judah, King Jehoash leads through or is a part of what we might call a consensus model of leadership, right? The people and king agree together on the course of action, and they all sort of do this as one, right? There's no commander, there's no figurehead who's directing everyone. They're just all in it, moving the same direction. So can you see like my leadership book coming together here, right? Two kings, Jehu the tyrant, Jehoash the diplomat. Both have the clear hand of God on their lives, right? Jehu is raised up as a king with a divine call. A prophet, the prophet came to him and said, "Thus saith the Lord." This is God's call. But Jehoash is preserved as king through divine providence. Born into the family that carries with it the promise of God to David's family. As the sole remaining heir, he is protected by this promise of God. These two kings, marked by God in different ways. What a comparison, right? So the question becomes, so which leadership style is better? Which way should my book lean, right? Toward which one? Who is the better king? Strong and principled warrior Jehu in the north, or team building kumbaya Jehoash in the south? The story takes us to a pretty incredible conclusion. For as different as the two kings were, a 7-year-old boy and a violent military commander, they both are a part of the exact same task, just in two different kingdoms. All right? The narrator of the book of Kings has set these two side by side, not just like in their place in the story, but by giving them the same task to do so that we have an apples to apples comparison, so that we can compare how these different kings each deal with the exact same issue. And the issue that Jehu and Jehoash face is that they are both done with the god Baal. Like they are completely done with Baal. Like they are over him. Baal has been a thorn in the sides of God's people for too long. So how do you get rid of a foreign god that has set himself up in your midst for some time now? Well, let me say something about how this foreign god Baal came to be worshipped in both Israel and in Judah. So if you remember back in the story, Baal came to Israel. Baal was introduced to God's people through the northern kingdom of Israel. Baal was the primary god of a place called Sidon, a nation up to the north, the place where Jezebel was from. And you might remember that Jezebel married King Ahab, king of Israel, the northern kingdom. And the way that the story is told, Ahab gives Jezebel a wedding gift by building Jezebel an altar to her home god. This would have been a way of making Jezebel feel comfortable, feel at home in this foreign land where she was now living with Ahab. Well, Ahab was king for a bit. And then two of his sons were king for just a relatively short period of time, and then Jehu became king. And the time frame is important because Jehu becomes king at a time when people are still alive when Baal was introduced to the kingdom. People remember the beginning of Baal worship in the northern kingdom. For the southern kingdom, Baal worship seems to have come to Judah through Ahab and Jezebel's daughters, through one of their daughters who came south and married one of the Judean kings. And so in this case, Baal worship is even newer in the southern kingdom in Judah than in the northern kingdom. And it's worth noting that in this, and the way that this unfolds, the pagan worship that comes to both of these places, the false god that is introduced to both of these cultures comes through marriage to an outsider. What is fascinating as a biblical theme, something worth reflecting on, is the way in which we bring values with us into marriage, into new contexts, into new relationships. And this is one of the stories being told, that through a marriage to an outsider, somebody who worshiped another god, somebody whose life was built on an entirely different value system, comes into and among the people of God and establishes this new way of being and thinking in their midst. But Jehu and Jehoash now have recognized the problem. Baal is a serious problem. He is a serious threat to their future. And he is more than just a lifeless statue, right? And I suggested this. He brings with him an entire value system that's incompatible with the worship of Yahweh. It's worth saying something about this, that when the Old Testament speaks of Yahweh as holy, when it goes out of its way to say that God has character, like moral traits, this is a departure from most of the cultures around the Israelites, who saw their gods as sort of free to do anything they wanted for whatever reason they wanted, and not carrying any particular moral characteristics. And so here, the people of Israel, the people of Yahweh, say God is a certain kind of God who orders the world in particular ways. And now there is this foreign value system that is growing like a cancer, that is influencing, that's attempting to overtake the worship of Yahweh. And Baal has corrupted the people of Israel. This is the story we've been reading. And so Baal must be eliminated from the land. This is then where Jehu and Jehoash are so compelling, setting out to do the exact same thing. They both intend to purify the nation. And so, how does this work out for them? We read the accounts earlier. Jehu, as is consistent with his behavior and character up to this point, pretends to be a worshiper of Baal. He deceives the people in order to gather all of the Baal followers together, and then he murders them, every last one. He tore down the temple for Baal. He burnt down and demolished the pillar of Baal. And he turned the place where Baal had been worshipped into an eternal latrine. That's embarrassing if you're a follower of Baal, but that's what you do. I mean, it's hard to argue with Jehu's success, right? His strength, his power, they're pretty effective. They worked. And King sums it up simply when it says, Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. Boom. Over, done with Baal. He's out of here. So what about Jehoash and his peace-loving, dovish ways? Well, Jehoash makes a covenant with the Lord and with the people, and this covenant that's made communally compels the community to purify the nation together. Together, all the people tore down the temple built for Baal. Together, the people tore down Baal's altar, and together they tore down all of the images that were used in worship. And just like that, Baal is gone in the south, just as in the north. And so in the north, in Israel, Jehu sent a clear message to all people: you worship Baal, and I am coming after you personally. In Judah, the community sent an equally clear message: Baal has no place among us, and you are with us or you are with Baal. Jehu and Jehoash, two different kings who accomplished the same goal. They both remove Baal completely from their respective kingdoms. So, what are the conclusions we can make? What are the conclusions we can make about leadership? When we think about these two men and the radically different approaches they have to their leading their kingdoms. Well, one of the most obvious conclusions is that it's actually really hard to make any conclusions here, right? What does the nation need? I know, a nation needs a strong, powerful leader. Or a movement of the people where the king is just a small piece of the whole. So which one is it? Yes and no, right? By itself, the story of Jehu confirms in us what the world has been telling us from our earliest days. From the moment we were born, the first movie probably that we watched, change happens through powerful leadership, through powerful heroes. This is why Israel begged for a king a couple hundred years ago. Because in the world that we live in, our eyes tell us kings make things happen. If you want to change society, you just need the right king, a powerful king. Jehu resonates in us yeah, we need a Jehu. But the moment that we are ready to say that, yes, that is what we need, we get this second story of a 7-year-old who actually doesn't really do anything except sort of be present there. And he's sort of merely swept along by the good, faithful desires of a priest and the people. So that if we can conclude anything, it may be this. We should be careful anytime someone tells us that we need strong leadership, like a strong central figure or a violent response to accomplish something good in the world. Because this story, at a minimum, sort of brings a balance to it to say, you know what? Others have often accomplished the very same things through other means. For Christians, we know that this is true. Jehoash is not our primary example of choosing an alternative to big, powerful leaders in the world and violence as the answer to our problems. Jehoash isn't the one that we need. He's just a sort of secondary illustration. Our main example is Jesus, right? In a violent world built around the power and the strength of kings, Rome with its Caesar, Israel with its King Herod, Jesus builds a kingdom, but not through strength, but through service. His kingdom is built on love, not on violence. And so we reread these stories from the First Testament and are reminded that, oh yeah, this isn't new with Jesus. This is the same story that God's been telling from the beginning. Let me transition to maybe another conclusion that we might make from this passage. Honestly, I've never seen a leadership book explore Jehu and Jehoash. That's why I think it could be so fun. But I think if you were to find one that was popular, a book that was popular today that used these two kings, I think the author's message would be really clear, and it would go something like this. Be yourself. Right? I mean, we are all about authenticity. Our culture, be authentically you. Be the leader that God made you to be, which usually means be the leader that comes most naturally to you. So if you're charismatic, if you're persuasive, if you're strong, if you're diplomatic, be that, flaunt it. If you're Jehu, be true. Oh, that rhymes. To you. There we go. If you're sometimes I write things and then I don't say them out loud, and then I say them out loud and I go, that's cheesy. But that's fine. If you're Jehu, be true to you, Jehu. Good work. If you're Joash, anybody got a rhyme for that one? Might as well just stick with it. Okay, be Joash. There you go. Be you. Do you. Right? The easy conclusion is it doesn't matter who you are. If you're Jehu or Jehoash, just be yourself. But there is actually a problem with Jehu. Jehu is exceedingly violent. Jehu is authentically and personally violent. And if we go all the way back to Genesis, we are reminded by the story that gets told, violence is one of the core expressions of sin in the human heart. I have to just confess something that I struggle with. It grates against everything in me that the Bible tells us that at times God has used people to commit acts of violence against others. This is a huge issue for me that I continue to wrestle with every time I submit myself to reading these words and believing that they are from God. But it seems important to at least point out a couple things about this. First, there are all sorts of hints and even some strong suggestions throughout this passage that God does not condone all of Jehu's violence. In fact, this is a broader theme in Scripture, that God uses a person or a nation to inflict violence against someone or another people. We'll get to it later in Kings when God raises up Assyria or God raises up Babylon against Israel. God uses a person or a nation to inflict violence, but almost every time the theme goes, that person or that nation that's been risen up goes too far. They do more than what God called them to do. They do more than what they were allowed to do. They exceed God's boundaries for that specific task. They get bloodthirsty, the prophets tell us, and they go beyond the bounds of what God has called them to do. I think that's one piece of what explains, one thing that explains some of Jehu here. But the other observation is that God enlists violent people to use their violence. What I mean by that is that God consistently gives people over to the desires of their hearts. God doesn't take a 7-year-old boy who was rescued from his entire family being wiped out and turn him violent. He chooses people who already hunger and thirst for violence, and he seems to let them run wild when judgment is necessary, when it is necessary to restrain evil. I wish I could say that these two sort of explanations or sort of points relieve me of the struggles I have with some of the violence that God seems to initiate in his word. but for me, they're mostly just a starting place. But it's important for us to recognize, in light of these two sort of points, that just because God has at times used violence should not be a reason for us to justify our own violence or the violence of our leaders. I think Jehu teaches us that. The idea that just because you want violence, just because you think violence will work, doesn't mean that you should give into that, as authentic as you may want to be. Be yourself is actually really terrible advice for a leader. In fact, we should never want our leaders to be themselves. Don't worry, I'm going to explain that because I know that might sound strange by itself, but God doesn't call us to be ourselves. God calls us to be transformed. God calls us to be holy as our Father in heaven is holy. The Bible teaches us to look for leaders who are imitating the character and the life of Jesus, who have the character of God being transformed in them. Be transformed. This is the call that we ought to respond to if we intend to lead well. This is the standard we ought to hold our leaders to. Not that they are perfect, but that they are seeking to be transformed by the good and gracious Spirit of God. Jehu is not only critiqued in the final summary of his life for his violence, but he's also critiqued by the rest of the story that Scripture is telling. Critiqued by the truth that who you are matters, right? But there's one more conclusion here that I think we have to consider. And this one overlaps with this last one a bit. As Americans, we are inherently pragmatic. We are pragmatists. We are people who get things done. We want to get things done. We don't have a lot of time for meetings where we talk about the kinds of things we might be doing, the kinds of people we should be. We look at each other in a meeting and we go, we got to do something. Let's just get it done. And so, as Americans, we thrive on just doing it. Just get at it. Just do something. We sort of adopt this sense that it doesn't matter who we are while we get it done. And it doesn't matter how we do it. It just matters that the task gets completed. So get rid of Baal. However you have to, whatever you have to do, get rid of Baal. And there's a bit of a movement in the American church today that has adopted this sort of pragmatism. And you could sum up the motto, you could sum up the movement with this motto: whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, do it. Whatever it takes to get people saved, whatever it takes to bring God's kingdom, whatever it takes to build the church, whatever it takes to get rid of Baal. I shared this story with some of you before, but a friend of mine from seminary first prayed a prayer in which he believes he became a Christian in something called a hell house. Close to Halloween, this is appropriate. These hell houses are haunted houses that lead you through various rooms of how terrible and awful hell is going to be, so that you are thoroughly scared, so that in that last room, somebody goes, "So will you become a Christian?" And people go, "Yes, please." Because they are scared out of their mind. And this friend of mine at seminary said, "It took me a long time to realize that God saved me, not through that hell house, but in spite of that hell house." That a group of people said, whatever it takes, we'll preach the gospel. But what they used was fear tactics. And we read in Romans, Paul saying it's God's kindness that leads us to repentance. And we go, what? right? What would lead a group of people to say, if we scare the heck out of people, man, they'll love Jesus so much? It's it's this whatever it takes. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you get them in and get them saved. There are a lot of people in our culture and in our world who I think would be so attracted to Jesus if they heard who Jesus is and who Jesus was. But all they've ever been given is the hell house Jesus. And we go, is it worth it to do whatever it takes if we fundamentally misrepresent the beauty of God, the love of God who sends his son not to condemn the world, but so that the world might have life? Whatever it takes to get rid of Baal, just do that. This is the place where we begin to justify violence, lying, greed, deceptiveness, deceit, whatever other immoral behavior we know doesn't have a place in our lives, but because we're doing it for Jesus, it's good. It justifies the end. And it's interesting how we do this, how consistently we do this, whether it's violence or lying or greed, and how we actually enlist the Bible to help us. So I'm not sure how many of you have ever read The Adventures of Huck Finn by Mark Twain. That's a really hard book to read for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because he uses the N-word a lot. If someone reads Huck Finn, in fact, people did read Huck Finn this way early on because they didn't know a better way to read it. If you read it superficially, if someone just reads the story and enjoys it but doesn't give it much thought, it's not that difficult to walk away from Huck Finn thinking that it's completely normal or okay to use the N-word because it's in there and it's in there a lot. And it's not that difficult for a person to walk away and go, Mark Twain says it's okay to use the N-word. But anybody who walks away from Huck Finn with that idea has completely missed the point of the book, right? That Twain's use of the word throughout the story is specifically intended to call out our prejudices, to highlight racism, to call it into question. But it shows how easily it is to read something and take something totally other than what the author intended. This is often the way that we use the Bible, whether it's to justify our violence or whatever other sin we might be excited to enlist in our lives and justify. We read the violence in the Bible and we go, see, it happened there. It's okay, I can do the same thing. But when we do this, we fundamentally miss the point. Violence is always a mark of the curse. And Jesus is at work setting his creation free from the curse. In all of its forms, in every way, Jesus is setting his creation free from the curse. This is incredible news for us. And what it means is that if you look at violence as curse, as a mark of the curse, and you trace it through the Bible, one of the points that's being made over and over again, if you follow it through time, is that violence never gets rid of evil. Whether it's the flood, whether it is, it doesn't matter. There is no point in the story when violence eradicates evil. And though evil often seems to work in the short term, over the long term, it always fails to bring life. It always fails to bring restoration to God's creation. Part of the story of violence in the Bible is to help us understand this and believe this. When we take a whatever it takes approach, it's important to recognize that we often will compromise our witness. We will often give the world a diminished view of God. We focused quite a bit on Jehu and on his violence. And this is probably where I should bring Jehoash back into the conversation to sort of wrap things up. It's easy to focus on what both kings did because they were both successful at it, and they're highlighted in the story. But it's actually really easy to miss what both kings failed to do. Neither of these kings actually fulfills his job description. Neither leads God's people in faithful worship. See, the north may be free of Baal finally, but the north still worships the Lord at two sanctuaries where there are golden calves established. And the south, we're told, the people continue to worship the Lord in all of these high places that they've set up that are close to their homes, that are like in their neighborhoods. And we're struck by a sort of final big leadership lesson these passages offer us, which is we worship God at our high places for so long. We've been engaged in false forms of worship for so long that we probably don't even realize it. We could go through extensive purification of our worship and never see it. One of the ways that I think this happens in our context is that churches spend an outrageous amount of time tweaking what we do on Sunday mornings. And the insanity about that is that the overwhelming language of worship in the New Testament is that worship is the way that we live every day. That worship is about the kind of people that we are, the kind of devotion we offer to God, the way that we live our lives every other day but this one. And yet churches spend almost all of our energy and our conversations about how do we make this more faithful so that we might tweak this and this might be pretty faithful, but if our lives are not marked by daily worship, this living offering to the Lord every day, then we're not any different than the Israelites. The funny thing is, it's always easy. It's always easy to identify Baal worship in our lives. Because Baal worship is new worship. Baal worship is exciting worship. The only reason we started doing it in the first place is because somebody came in and goes, you should try this. It's great. It works. We love it. And it doesn't take that long before you realize it's empty. But Baal worship stands out to us because it's new. And so it's easy when you go, okay, we know we've got something off, but what is that thing? You go, well, that's the new thing. And so it's easy for us to cast away new and foreign influences in our lives. You can think about technology. Every generation looks at new technology and goes, woe is us, right? Life used to be so much more simple and less distracted. And so we make it an issue of phones and Facebook. But the problem, the sin, clearly is deeper than that. Facebook and phones just become a new way, a modern way of living out those same old ways of ignoring God. Jehu gets rid of Baal, but he can't see the real problem. Neither he nor his people worship the Lord as he has asked them to worship him. See, because here's the really awkward thing about Jehu. If Jehu saw himself and his people for what they were, for people who worship Yahweh but worship him in the ways that they are, he'd actually have to kill himself and the rest of his own people. This is one of the problems with violence. Just to go back to it for a second again, we're really good at using it against the people who have a speck in their own eye. But Jehu and his fellow Yahweh worshipers have a stinking log in their eye. Jehu can't see the problem. Jehoash can't see the problem. This is the crazy thing about these two. They're both successful. They both get lines at the bottom that go, they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Jehu has a qualification under him, but still, he's good, mostly. One of the things that I found most compelling last week, as we heard Brian and Candace share their testimonies before they got baptized, was this idea that they have begun to see what they couldn't see before. That their baptism was about beginning to die to those things that seemed to be like the most normal and natural things about life and about sort of getting on in this world. But the Lord began to show them the high places in their lives. And they have begun to respond. I've heard a number of you in your small group studies asking questions about the small group studies. There's a question that keeps coming up. What are the high places in your life? And I have to be honest with you about something. I don't know if any of us can ever answer that question for ourselves. I keep throwing the question out there, but in part because by facing it, we go, I don't know. And the moment you say, I don't know, is the moment you need a community of people around you to look at you and to say, I can help you name the high places in your life if you will let me. This morning we come to the table, a table of grace, a table surrounded by people who have equal standing, a table of people who are undeserving, but a table that Jesus has invited, filled with people who Jesus has invited. And it's with these people that are a community, that are a part of a family, that I think we can turn to one another and go, will you help me name the high places in my life? If we would have that conversation with each other around the table, I think we would begin to find our lives being transformed in powerful and new ways.